Dan and Amy. Well, there are stories coming out of Europe again about Muslim immigrants.
They're almost so disgusting to even repeat, but it's really going on.
You had, this is in Breitbart, but they're reporting what an Austrian paper reported where a 36-year-old mother of three, identified only as Sandra F. by the Austrian paper, was with her children at a pool, 10-year-old daughter, two sons aged 3 and 6. She told the newspaper, the Austrian paper, I noticed 6 foreigners aged between 30 and 40 years old in the indoor pool. 2 were sitting on the edge of the children's pool. One of them sidled up to my youngest and had his hands in his underwear. The police were not. The woman removed her children, informed the lifeguard. The migrant man touching himself was removed from the pool. Police were not called.
Why not?
Well, this is the whole. I mean, we've talked previously about the attacks, the sexual assaults that occurred on New Year's in Cologne, Germany, which ultimately led to the termination of the Cologne police chief in Germany for kind of trying to sweep this all under the rug as a tribute to the culture of politically correct multiculturalism in Europe. But this is the reality on the ground, and it
doesn't stop there, though. There's more disgusting reports of
you're right.
Feces in pools, masturbating in jacuzzis. I mean, it's just invading girls' changing rooms. That
was a story that came out of Germany yet again. That's right. And it makes it difficult when you don't have people speak out. I mean, the authorities, number one, people in charge, kind of just being honest about what's happening. And also, too, I hate to put it on the Muslim community as a whole, because I assume those like our next guest are not defending this. But I think there's a real desire for Westerners to hear from more leadership within the Muslim community, respected leaders in the Muslim community, denouncing this so that we don't fall into the trap of over-extrapolating from the anecdotal and suggesting this is more than it is, while not denying that it is what it is. And to help us with that, we're pleased to welcome back to the show Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. He is the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. Dr. Jasser, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate being with you again.
So how should we understand these stories that are coming out of Western Europe about the boorish, if not oftentimes criminal behavior of a lot of individuals who have immigrated to those countries from places like Syria?
I don't think there is any way to understand it. Any human being would be repulsed and horrified by this, and it is. We saw this after the revolutions in Egypt and Syria, that these dictatorships have been a pressure cooker that have been brewing a corruption and a deterioration of society now for over 50 years since World War II. And as a result, now you're seeing, whether it be internally with revolutions or externally as they ship these refugees out. I mean, make no mistake, the Assad regime wants to depopulate Syria, so they hand it out. My family in Aleppo and Damascus told me that they were just dishing out passports in the millions earlier this year because they weren't the ones they aren't able to kill of the Sunni majority. They want to basically export into Europe, so they've pushed them all out. And bottom line is that among those that include some of the best of their society, it's going to include some of the worst of their society, criminals, deviants, and pathogens. And you're right, the Muslim community has been silent, and we formed a Muslim reform movement that talks about principles that we view to be humanitarian, universal principles that we Muslims need to stand up and reject. There's the misogyny, there's deep rejection of Western values that many of these refugees bring with them, and we have to confront this as a cancer within the current status of the interpretation of Islam in much of our society.
Well, as a devout Muslim, when you hear stories about this, about sex attacks by Muslim migrants on groups of women, and then what they're doing in these pools and in jacuzzis, how does that make you feel? And is there anything you could do to stop it?
It beyond horrifies me. You know, I worry about what legacy we're leaving for our kids. You know, in my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, I have a letter to my children. And I hope, you know, our society and Muslims wake up and realize that this doesn't come from nowhere. Many of these people view there's a land of Islam, and then everywhere that's not Muslim majority, they view it as a land of war. And Europe is the people, the citizens, especially the women of this society, these radicals view as simply property that they can do anything they want with. And this isn't coming out of nowhere. Look at how women are treated in Saudi Arabia, which is basically the boot camp for ISIS, where you have rape victims become criminals because they are supposedly not supposed to be alone with a man, and yet they are the horrific victims of rape. And this is the Saudi Sharia law. So we Muslims need to wake up to understand that if we love our faith, we need to stand up and protest. And there have been some protests in Europe where you see Muslims holding signs that say we respect, we love European values, but it's just not been loud enough, and they need to more vocally reject and ask Europe to ship these people back.
We're talking to Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. He's the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. Dr. Jasser, I wonder what your reaction was to President Obama's State of the Union address a couple weeks ago, which was consistent with what he's been saying in this general topic for a while, that essentially what I would describe as just being honest about what's happening on the ground in places the world over. He suggests that somehow is exactly what ISIS wants, that we can't speak the truth and include some context to the truth, but speak the truth nonetheless. What's your reaction to what he has to say about how we should discuss these issues?
Well, he was sort of, I have to say, a bit schizophrenic in his interpretations, in that he said two things. On the first time, this was the first time I heard him actually say that the Muslim community has issues they need to deal with and we need to address. I mean, I found that very reassuring, that there was some realism to it, and that for a president that doesn't want to identify it as Islamic, which basically gives Muslims a pass, he said, well, wait a minute, Muslims need to address these issues. So on the one hand, that was reassuring. But on the other hand, there was a bit of a passive-aggressive nature in that he didn't give us marching orders to address the ideology and simply dismissed it. I will tell you, though, that he's right on one thing, which is that we have to be careful. I do believe, even though I've got family trying to get out of Syria, we have to put a pause until we figure out how to vet refugees, until we understand how not to make this a suicide pact in our humanitarianism in the West. But having said that, we can't change the narrative. If we change the narrative that America is the place for religious freedom, for religious liberty, in every war, be it World War II, the Vietnam War, we have been a haven for those in places in which we've been at war. We were at war in Vietnam, at war in World War II, and yet we brought in German refugees and others, Vietnamese refugees. So we have to be able to thread that needle. And if we change the narrative, then we basically surrender to the ISIS narrative, which is that the West is the land of war and the land of Islam is theirs in Syria and in their so-called caliphate. So, we have to be careful. The messaging we put out will be that message that tells Muslims that want to reform against both evils, the evil of Assad and the evil of ISIS, that we are on their side for freedom and liberty. And we can't change that narrative and say that, us against all Muslims, because we will basically surrender the narrative of reform and revolution to the most radical in their society.
Dr. Jasser, you just mentioned that your family members, you're trying to get them out of Syria. How many family members, and are you doing anything to try and help them get here?
Well, we had asked them a couple of years ago when it was easier to come, and they didn't want to leave their homes. And now, they live in Aleppo, which is right on the front line, some of them, and the others in Damascus, which have been near a couple chemical weapons attacks from the Assad regime. And, on the one hand, they know if they walk away from their homes, they'll have nothing to come back to. On the other hand, they don't know if it'll be there next week. They're living hand to mouth. There's really no channels in which to bring them in, which is sad in that, there's so many expatriate Syrians. Our families are here. It would be so easy to have a program that would allow us to bring them to live with our families and not be refugees per se, but have them be productive members rather than simply have millions, many of whom have family that could vouch for them. And yet, unfortunately, you have this masses of humanity being lumped in, where you have criminals lumped in with really good families that are, very moral and were part of a revolution that really were abandoned. So we don't know what to tell them. There's no real avenue. They're supposed to go to Beirut, to the embassy there, which is overwhelmed and not responding to anyone. Some are going through Turkey, which also has been very problematic. So we're open to ideas.
I wonder, talking about kind of threading this needle, the issue of putting a pause until we know who's coming into this country and why, at the same time as leaving the door open to those who are being persecuted for their religion, as we always have, as you described. Does it also make sense, as some have suggested, to not move all of those who have fled Syria to Western Europe or to the United States, and to set up, as there is, UN camp in Jordan, in the region, even maybe creating a safe zone in Syria, so that ultimately, when this civil war of the Assad oppression subsides, people can go back and rebuild? Does that make sense?
Amen. I mean, that's what we were testifying to. I was testifying to Congress in 2011, 2012, before ISIS even existed. We were saying that while the White House was insulting Syrians and saying that, oh, these are pharmacists, engineers, they really don't know how to fight wars, we can't support them, for a country based in a revolution of the lay people against theocracy, it was sort of bizarre to see our White House saying that. And we were telling them in Washington that if you don't at least we're not saying to put boots on the ground. This is very different than Iraq. You had an indigenous revolution of a majority of the Syrian population fighting against the Assad regime, and we abandoned them and armed basically 50 to a couple hundred, which was absurd. And we said, you know what? There's going to be a magnet for jihadists all over the planet into this country. They are going to be released from prisons. Assad is going to release al-Qaeda in order to legitimize continued oppression of the majority, and that's exactly what he did. Assad released al-Qaeda into Iraq to kill our troops. So it was not a big, leap for us to warn Congress that, and to warn the West that this is what's going to happen. And sure enough, come 2013, ISIS puts its flag down. The Ba'ath in Iraq started to be complicit with ISIS, and you now have this threat of ISIS. You can't get rid of ISIS without getting rid of Assad. The refugee problem could have been solved and can still be, and somewhat band-aided, if you will, with a no-fly zone. The problem with the no-fly zone now is we feel, our families tell us, that Syria has been in hospice since September 30th. What happened September 30th? Russia began flying sorties over Syria, which creates a conflict where Russia is basically put its foot down and saying it will make sure Assad stays in power, which is basically the complicit forwarding of a continued genocide. There's a genocidal sandwich happening in Syria, when the one side, Assad against the Sunni majority, and on the other side, ISIS against every minority there.
He is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. He's the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. His book, worth checking out, Battle for the Soul of Islam, An American Muslim Patriot's Fight to Save His Faith. Dr. Jasser, thanks again for joining us. Appreciate your time.
Anytime. Thank you.